very, very much for your patience. I had a lovely day yesterday. I went to visit some friends, and it's the first time I've actually been out socially, and I can't remember when. So just to be able to hug somebody and have a cup of tea and be, it was really wonderful. It was. So let me say hi to whoever's here. Let me just make this live chat. And let me pop out the participants. Kathy Miller and Ginger Gargoyle and me. That's all that's here. I read 6. All right. So we are live reading The Little House on the Prairie book, which we now have established is almost entirely fiction. And any actual accounts that she's recalling are stories or memories of other people, not her, because she was just a baby. She may have remembered being lifted from window to window because they were in Indian territory, but she was only 18 months old at the time. She was the baby, right? But the tree wouldn't make any difference. I've never tapped a tree, but I would think the tree wouldn't make any difference. Not sure I understand that. All right. Moving in. Little House on the Prairie, Chapter 6. And again, thank you for your patience. Right? Oh, I got to change my glasses. I'm ready for trifocals. I know I am. Okay. Chapter 6. Moving in. The walls are up, Pa was saying to Ma in the morning. We'd better move in and get along as best we can without a floor or other fixings. I must build the stable as fast as I can so Pet and Patty can be inside the walls. 2. Last night I could hear wolves howling from every direction. Seemed like, and close, too. Well, you have your gun, so I'll not worry, said Ma. Yes, and there's Jack. But I'll feel easier in my mind when you and the girls have good solid walls around you. Why do you suppose we haven't seen any Indians? Ma asked. Oh, I don't know, Pa replied carelessly. I've seen their camping places among the bluffs. They're away on a hunting trip now, I guess. Then Ma called, Girls, the sun's up, and Laura and Mary scrambled out of bed and into their clothes. Eat your breakfasts quickly, Ma said, putting the last of the rabbit stew on their tin plates. We're moving into the house today, and all the chips must be out. So they ate quickly and hurried to carry all the chips out of the house. They ran back and forth as fast as they could, gathering their skirts full of chips and dumping them in a pile near the fire. But there were still chips on the ground and inside the house when Ma began to sweep it with her willow bough broom. Ma limped, though her sprained ankle was beginning to get well, but she soon swept the earthen floor, and then Mary and Laura began to help her carry things into the house. Pa was on top of the walls, stretching the canvas wagon top over the skeleton roof of saplings. The canvas billowed in the wind. Pa's beard blew wildly, and his hair stood up from his head as if it were trying to pull itself out. He held on to the canvas and fought it. Once it jerked so hard that Laura thought he must go or sail into the air like a bird. He must let go or sail into the air like a bird. But he held tight to the wall with his legs and tight to the canvas with his hands, and he tied it down. There, he said. Stay where you are and be. Charles, Ma said. She stood with her arms full of quilts, looking up at him reprovingly. And be good, said Pa to the canvas. Why, Carolyn, what'd you think I was going to say? Oh, Charles, she said, you scallywag. Pa came right down the corner of the house. The ends of the logs stuck out, and he used them for a ladder. He ran his hand through his hair so that it stood up even more wildly, and Ma burst out laughing. Then he hugged her, quilts and all. Then they looked at the house, and Pa said, How's that for a snug house? I'll be thankful to get into it, said Ma. There was no door, there were no windows. There was no floor except the ground and no roof except the canvas, but that house had good stout walls and it would stay where it was. It was not like the wagon that every morning went on to some other place. We're going to do well here, Caroline, Pa said. It's a great country. This is a country I'll be contented to stay in the rest of my life. Even when it's settled up? Asked Ma. Even when it's settled up, no matter how thick and close the neighbors get, this country'll never feel crowded. Look at that sky. Laura knew what he meant. She liked this place too. She liked the enormous sky and the winds and the land that you couldn't see to the end of. Everything was so fresh and clean and big and splendid. By dinner time, the house was in order. The beds were neatly made on the floor. The wagon seat and 2 ends of logs were brought in for chairs. Pa's gun lay on its pegs above the doorway. Boxes and bundles were neat against the walls. It was a pleasant house. A soft light came through the canvas roof. Wind and sunshine came through the window holes, and every crack in the 4 walls glowed glowed a little because the sun was overhead. Only the campfire stayed out where it had been. Pa said he would build a fireplace in the house as soon as he could. He would hew out slabs to make a solid roof, too, before winter came. He could lay a puncheon floor and make beds and tables and chairs, but all that work must wait until he had helped Mr. Edwards and had built a stable for Pet and Patty. When that's all done, said Ma, I want a clothesline. Pa laughed. Yes, and I want a well. After dinner, he hitched Pet and Patty to the wagon, and he hauled a tub full of water from the creek so that Ma could do the washing. You could wash the clothes in the creek, he told her. Indian women do. If we wanted to live like Indians, you could make a hole in the roof to let the smoke out, and we'd have a fire on the floor inside the house, said Ma. Indians do. That afternoon, she washed the clothes in the tub and spread them on the grass to dry. After supper, they sat for a while by the campfire. That night, they would sleep in the house. They would never sleep beside a campfire again. That afternoon, she washed the clothes in the tub and spread them on the grass to dry. After supper, they sat for a while by the campfire. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that part, but now we're repeating. That night, they would sleep in the house. They would never sleep by the campfire again. Pa and Ma talked about the folks in Wisconsin, and Ma wished she could send them a letter. But Independence was 40 miles away, and no letter could go until Pa made the long trip to the post office there. Back in the big woods so far away, Grandpa and Grandma and the aunts and uncles and cousins did not know where Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary and baby Carrie were. And sitting there by the campfire, no one knew what might have happened in the big woods. There was no way to find out. Well, it's bedtime, Ma said. Baby Carrie was already asleep. Ma carried her into the house and undressed her, while Mary unbuttoned Laura's dress and petticoat waist down the back, and Pa hung a quilt over the door hole. The quilt would be better than no door. Then Pa went out to bring Pet and Patty close to the house. He called back softly, "Come out here, Caroline, and look at the moon." Laura and Mary lay in their little bed on the ground inside the new house and watched the sky through the window hole to the east. The edge of the big bright moon glittered at the bottom of the window space, and Laura sat up. She looked at the great moon sailing silently higher in the clear sky. Its light made the silvery lines in all the cracks on that side of the house. The light poured through the window hole and made a square of soft radiance on the floor. It was so bright that Laura saw Ma plainly in it when she lifted the quilt at the door and came in. Then Laura very quickly lay down before Ma saw her naughtily sitting up in bed. She heard Pet and Patty whinnying softly to Pa. Then the faint thuds of their feet came into her ear from the floor. Pet and Patty and Pa were coming towards the house, and Laura heard Pa singing, "Sail on, silver moon, shed your radiance o'er the sky." His voice was like a part of the night and the moonlight and the stillness of the prairie. He came to the doorway singing, "By the pale silver light of the moon." Softly, Ma said, "Hush, Charles, you'll wake the children." So Pa came in without a sound. Jack followed at his heels and lay across the doorway. Now they were all inside the stout walls of their new home, and they were snug and safe. Drowsily, Laura heard a long wolf howl rising from far away on the prairie, but only a little shiver went up her backbone, and she fell asleep. We always hear only about Pa's family, never Ma's. I wonder why. Because she obviously didn't speak about them a lot, right? So do we want to read chapter 7, The Wolf Pack? Let me see. It's a long one, so it'll have to do you till next week. All right. Chapter 7, The Wolf Pack. All in one day, Pa and Mr. Edwards built the stable for Pet and Patty. They even put the roof on, working so late that Ma had to keep supper waiting for them. There was no stable door, but in the moonlight, Pa drove 2 stout posts well into the ground, one on either side of the doorway. He put Pet and Patty inside the stable, and then he laid small split logs, one above the other, across the door space. The posts held them, and they made a solid wall. "Now," said Pa, "let those wolves howl. I'll sleep tonight." In the morning, when he lifted the split logs from behind the posts, Laura was amazed. Beside Pet stood a long-legged, long-eared, wobbly little colt. When Laura ran towards it, gentle Pat laid back her ears and snapped her teeth at Laura. "Keep back, Laura," Pa said sharply. He said to Pet, "Now, Pet, you know we won't hurt your little colt." Pet answered him with a soft whinny. She would let Pa stroke her colt, but she would not let Laura or Mary come near it. When they even peeked at it through the cracks in the stable wall, Pet rolled the whites of her eyes at them and showed them her teeth. They had never seen a colt with ears so long. Pa said it was a little mule, but Laura said it looked like a jackrabbit, so they named the little colt Bunny. When Pet was on the picket line, with Bunny frisking around her and wondering at the big world, Laura must watch baby Carrie carefully. If anyone but Pa came near Bunny, Pet squealed with rage and dashed to bite that little girl. Early that Sunday afternoon, Pa rode Patty away across the prairie to see what he could see. See what he should see. There was plenty of meat in the house, so he did not take his gun. He rode away through the tall grass along the rim of the creek bluffs. Birds flew up before him and circled and sank into the grasses. Pa was looking down into the creek bottoms as he rode. Perhaps he was watching deer browsing there. Then Patty broke into a gallop, and swiftly she and Pa grew smaller. Soon there was only waving grass where they had been. Late that afternoon, Pa had not come home. Ma stirred the coals of the fire and laid chips on them and began to get supper. Mary was in the house minding the baby, and Laura asked Ma, "What's the matter with Jack?" Jack was walking up and down looking worried. He wrinkled his nose at the wind, and his hair rose up on his neck and lay down and then rose up again. Pet's hoofs were suddenly thudded. She ran around the circle of her picket rope and stood still, wickering a low wicker. Bunny came close to her. Excuse me. "What's the matter, Jack?" Ma asked. He looked up at her, but he couldn't say anything. Ma gazed around the whole circle of earth and sky. She could not see anything unusual. Likely it isn't anything, Laura, she said. She raked coals around the coffee pot and the spider and on top of the bake oven. The prairie hen sizzled in the spider, and the corn cakes began to smell good. But all the time, Ma kept glancing out at the prairie all around. Jack walked about restlessly, and Pet did not graze. She faced the northwest, where Pa had gone, and kept her colt close beside her. All at once, Patty came running across the prairie. She was stretched out, running with all her might, and Pa was leaning almost flat on her neck. She ran past the stable before Pa could stop her. He stopped her so hard she almost sat down. She was trembling all over, and her black coat was streaked with sweat and foam. Pa swung off her. He was breathing hard, too. "What is the matter, Charles?" Ma asked him. Pa was looking towards the creek. So Ma and Laura looked at it too, but they could only see the space above the bottomlands with a few treetops in it, and the distant tops of the earthen bluffs under the high prairie's grasses. "What is it?" Ma asked again. "Why did you ride Patty like that?" Pa breathed a quick, long breath. "I was afraid the wolves would beat me here, but I see everything's all right." "Wolves?" she cried. "What wolves?" "Everything's all right, Caroline," Pa said. "Let a fellow get his breath." When he had got some breath, he said, "I didn't ride Patty like that. It was all I could do to hold her at all. 50 wolves, Caroline, the biggest wolves I ever saw. I wouldn't go through such a thing again, not for a mint of money." A shadow came over the prairie just then because the sun had gone down, and Pa said, "I'll tell you about it later." "We'll eat supper in the house," Ma said. "No need of that," Pa told her. "Jack will give us warning in plenty of time." He brought Pet and her colt from the picket line. He didn't take them and Patty to drink from the creek, as he usually did. He gave them the water in Ma's wash tub, which was standing full, ready for the washing the next morning. He rubbed down Patty's sweaty sides and legs and put her in the barn with Pet and Bunny. Supper was ready. The campfire made a circle of light in the dark. Laura and Mary stayed close to the fire and kept baby Carrie with them. They could feel the dark all around them, and they kept looking behind them at the place where the dark had mixed with the edge of the firelight. Shadows moved there as if they were alive. Jack sat on his haunches beside Laura. The edges of his ears were lifted, listening to the dark. Now and then he walked a little way into it. He walked all around the camp and came back to sit beside Laura. The hair lay flat on his thick neck, and he did not growl. His teeth showed a little, but that was because he was a bulldog. Laura and Mary ate their corn cakes and the prairie hen's drumsticks, and they listened to Pa while he told Ma about the wolves. He found some more neighbors. Settlers were coming in, settling all along both sides of the creek. Less than 3 miles away, in a hollow on the high prairie, a man and his wife were building a house. Their name was Scott, and Pa said they were nice folks. 6 miles beyond them, 2 bachelors were living in one house. They had taken 2 farms and built the one house on the line between them. One man's bunk was against one wall of the house, and the other man's bunk was against the other wall. So each man slept on his own farm, although they were in the same house, and the house was only 8 feet wide. That's probably because if you took a claim, you had to live on it. So they didn't want to build 2 houses for 2 men, right? They cooked and ate together in the middle of the house. Pa had not said anything about the wolves yet. Laura wished he would, but she knew that she must not interrupt while Pa was talking. He said that these bachelors did not know that anyone else was in the country. They had seen nobody but Indians, so they were glad to see Pa, and he stayed there longer than he had meant to. Then he rode on, and from a little rise in the prairie, he saw a white speck down in the creek bottoms. He thought it was a covered wagon, and it was. When he came to it, he found a man and his wife and 5 children. They had come from Iowa, and they had camped in the bottoms because one of their horses was sick. The horse was better now, but the bad night air so near the creek had given them the fever and ague. I'm not sure. I can never remember how to pronounce it, but I think it's ague or ague. Ague. The man and his wife and 3 oldest children were too sick to stand up. The little boy and girl, no bigger than Mary and Laura, were taking care of them. So Pa did what he could for them, and then he rode back to tell the bachelors about them. One of them rode right away to fetch the family up on the high prairie where they would soon get well in the good air. One thing had led to another until Pa was starting home later than he had meant. He took a short cut across the prairie, and as he was loping along on Paddy, suddenly out of a little draw came a pack of wolves. They were all around Pa in a moment. It was a big pack, Pa said. All of 50 wolves, and the biggest wolves I ever saw in my life. Must be what they call buffalo wolves. Their leader's a big gray brute that stands 3 feet at the shoulder, if an inch. I tell you, my hair stood straight on end. And you didn't have your gun, said Ma. I thought of that, but my gun would have been no use if I'd had it. You can't fight 50 wolves with one gun. And Paddy couldn't outrun them. What did you do? Ma asked. Nothing, said Pa. Paddy tried to run. I never wanted anything worse than I wanted to get away from there, but I knew if Paddy even started, those wolves would be on us in a minute, pulling us down, so I held Paddy to a walk. Goodness, Charles, Ma said under her breath. Yes, I wouldn't go through such a thing again for any money, Caroline. I never saw such wolves. One big fellow trotted along right by my stirrup. I could have kicked him in the ribs. They didn't pay any attention to me at all. They must have just made a kill and eaten all they could. I tell you, Caroline, those wolves just closed in around Paddy and me and trotted along with us. In broad daylight. For all the world like a pack of dogs going along with a horse. They were all around us, trotting along and jumping and playing and snapping at each other, just like dogs. Goodness, Charles, Ma said again. Laura's heart was thumping fast, and her mouth and her eyes were wide open, staring at Pa. Paddy was shaking all over and fighting the bit, said Pa. Sweat ran off her, she was so scared, and I was sweating too, but I held her down to a walk. We went walking along among those wolves. They came right along with us, a quarter of a mile or more. That big fellow trotted by my stirrup as if he were there to stay. Then we came to the head of the draw, running down into the creek bottoms. The big gray leader went down in it, and all the rest of the pack trotted down into it behind him. As soon as the last one was in the draw, I let Paddy go. She headed straight for home across the prairie, and she couldn't have run faster if I'd been cutting into her with a rawhide whip. I was scared the whole way. I thought the wolves might be coming this way, and they might be making better time than I was. I was glad you had the gun, Caroline, and glad the house is built. I knew you could keep the wolves out of the house with the gun, but Pet and the colt were outside. You need not have worried, Charles, Ma said. I guess I would manage to save our horses. I was not fully reasonable at the time, said Pa. I know you would save the horses, Caroline. Those wolves wouldn't bother you anyway. If they had been hungry, I wouldn't be here to... Little pictures have big ears, Ma said. She meant he must not frighten Mary and Laura. Well, all's well that ends well, Pa replied. And those wolves are miles from here by now. What made them act like that? Laura asked him. I don't know, Laura, he said. I guess they had just eaten all they could hold and they were on their way to the creek to get a drink. Or perhaps they were out playing on the prairie and not paying any attention to anything but their play, like little girls do sometimes. Perhaps they saw that I didn't have my gun and couldn't do them any harm. Or perhaps They never seen a man before and didn't know that men can do them any harm. So they didn't think about me at all. Pet and Patty were restlessly walking around and around inside the barn. Jack walked around the campfire. When he stood still to smell the air and listen, the hair lifted on his neck. Bedtime for little girls, Ma said cheerfully. Not even baby Carrie was sleepy yet, but Ma took them all into the house. She told Mary and Laura to go to bed, and she put baby Carrie's little nightgown on and laid her in the big bed. When she went outdoors to do the dishes, Laura wanted Pa and Ma in the house. They seemed so far away outside. Mary and Laura were good and lay still, but Carrie sat up and played by herself in the dark. In the dark, Pa's arm came from behind the quilt and in the doorway and very quietly took away his gun. Out by the campfire, the tin plates rattled. Then a knife scraped the spider. Ma and Pa were talking together, and Laura smelled tobacco smoke. The house was safe, but it did not feel safe because Pa's gun was not over the door, and there was no door, only the quilt. Excuse me. After a long while, Ma lifted the quilt. Baby Carrie was asleep then. Ma and Pa came in very quietly and very quietly went to bed. Jack lay across the doorway, but his chin was not on his paws. His head was up, listening. Ma breathed softly, Pa breathed heavily, and Mary was asleep too. But Laura strained her eyes in the dark to watch Jack. She could not tell whether the hair was standing up on his neck. Suddenly, she was sitting straight up in bed. She had been asleep. The dark was gone. Moonlight streamed through the window hole, and streaks of moonlight came through every crack in that wall. Pa stood black in the moonlight at the window. He had his gun. Right in Laura's ear, a wolf howled. She scringed away from the wall. The wolf was on the other side of it. Laura was too scared to make a sound. The cold was not in her backbone only. It was all through her. Mary pulled the quilt over her head. Jack growled and showed his teeth at the quilt in the doorway. "Be still, Jack," Pa said. Terrible howls curled all around the inside of the house, and Laura rose out of bed. She wanted to go to Pa, but she knew better than to bother him now. He turned his head and saw her standing in her nightgown. "You want to see him, Laura?" he asked softly. Laura couldn't say anything, but she nodded and patted across the ground to him. He stood his gun against the wall and lifted her up to the window hole. There in the moonlight sat a half circle of wolves. They sat on their haunches and looked at Laura in the window, and she looked at them. She had never seen such big wolves. The biggest one was taller than Laura. He was taller even than Mary. He sat in the middle exactly opposite Laura. Everything about him was big. His pointed ears, his pointed mouth with the tongue hanging out, and his strong shoulders and legs, and his two paws side by side, and his tail curled around the squatting haunch. His coat was shaggy and gray, and his eyes were glittering green. Laura clutched her toes into a crack of the wall, and she folded her arms on the window slab, and she looked and looked at that wolf. But she did not put her head through the empty window space into the outdoors where all those wolves sat so near her, shifting their paws and licking their chops. Pa stood firm against her back and kept his arm tight around her middle. "He's awfully big," whispered Laura. "Yes, and see how his coat shines," Pa whispered into her hair. The moonlight made little glitters in the edges of the shaggy fur all around the big wolf. "They're in a ring clear around the house," Pa whispered. Laura pattered beside him to the other window. He leaned his gun against that wall and lifted her up again. There, sure enough, was the other half of the circle of wolves. All their eyes glittered green in the shadow of the house. Laura could hear their breathing. When they saw Pa and Laura looking out, the middle of the circle moved back a little way. Pet and Patty were squealing and running inside the barn. Their hooves pounded and the ground crashed against the wall. Their hooves pounded and crashed against the walls. After a moment, Pa went back to the other window, and Laura went too. They were just in time to see the big wolf lift his nose till it pointed straight at the sky, and his mouth opened and a long howl rose towards the moon. Then all around the house, the circle of wolves pointed their noses toward the sky and answered him. Their howls shuddered through the house and filled the moonlight and quavered away across the vast silence of the prairie. Now go back to bed, little half-pint, Pa said. Go to sleep. Jack and I will take care of you all. So Laura went back to bed, but for a long time she did not sleep. She lay and listened to the breathing of the wolves on the other side of the log wall. She heard the scratch of their claws on the ground and the snuffling of a nose at a crack. She heard the big gray leader howl again, and all the others answered him. But Pa was walking quietly from one window hole to the other, and Jack did not stop pacing up and down before the quilt that hung in the doorway. The wolves might howl, but they would not get in while Pa and Jack were there. So at last, Laura fell asleep. I hope you enjoyed that. Green, I might be able to... Yeah, I know. They're more of a good... They say green, but, it depends on the light. It really does depend on the color of the light. Moonlight is different than refracted lamplight, right? It would change the color that refracts back. Maybe. I don't know. Our female husky used to howl whenever she was outside until we got another dog. Evidently, that's not exactly correct. If there are big predators around, anything that is prey stays very quiet. The horses wouldn't be acting like that. Remember, this is a fictionalized account of stories that Laura heard from when they lived, or when they did live in Indian Territory for a while. Laura was only 18 months old, so this is pretty much fiction. And her, taking stories she's heard and building on them. It's almost singing. I know our Penny Pasta used to sing. And you realize he was right in reining in his horse and keeping it to a walk, because at the first sign of flight, that makes the wolves go prey, boom. But when they're just like all moving along, they probably weren't even thinking about it. They would have thought about it if the horse had began to run in panic, right? Horses tend to panic whenever they sense danger. They want to flee. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anyway, I'm glad you joined me. Thank you for joining me for Little House Live, day 27, and we will be back on schedule Saturday next week with Little House Live, day 28, and 2 stout doors. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, it all depends. Oh, I hear coyotes all the time, but you get the occasional wolf, and like wolf pack, and they're not that big around here, but they come down out of the mountain here, right? And the coyotes, you never hear them when you hear the wolves. And the best part is I'll go out and I'll swim in my pool in the middle of the night, and I'll hear the coyotes, and I'll do a wolf howl, and they'll shut right up. And then, sometimes hours later, I'll hear actual wolves. So, I mean, it's really kind of cool. So, you're welcome. You're welcome. We'll see you next Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for Little House Live Day 28. All right, I'm going to go dish up supper. Take care. Mwah! God bless, and we'll see you next week.